So where have we gone so far? We've come from this idea that, well, all violence is caused by sin, but not all violence is sinful. God Himself operates in violence. Then we've landed on this place where there's legitimate man-killing and there's illegitimate man-killing. It's important to see that in the Old Testament, self-defense was regulated. Now, somebody could maybe tell me something else, but in my studies, I've only found one passage that is specifically related to self-defense in the Old Testament, and this is it right here. Exodus chapter 22. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. So let me paint a picture for you. You live in the Old Testament times, and Alva Edison has not invented the incandescent bulb, and when it goes nighttime, it is dark. Yeah, they did have lamps, but let's say in the middle of the night while you're asleep, somebody breaks into your house. You don't know who they are, you don't know what they're doing there, and you scuffle and kill the person. According to the law, because it was nighttime, even if they were just a thief, you were not guilty because there was no way for you to know that they were just a thief. Now, the next thing that shows us is that thievery is not a capital crime. But if you come into your house in the middle of the day and you see somebody walking off with your TV and you kill them, that is illegitimate man-killing. Do you see how this law applies? This is the only place in Scripture that I know of where there's a regulation given on self-defense. So what that tells me is that self-defense was an expected action, but it had to be regulated on certain occasions because self-defense is not an excuse for murder. Now, on the back of your notes, I have a bunch of scripture. And what we're going to do now is take a look at 3 biblical case studies where we see self-defense and biblical self-defense in action. The first is in Nehemiah chapter 4. I'll give you a little background on Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a Jew who had advanced very significantly in the Persian government. And this took place after the time when God said, "Oh, Israel, you have failed so miserably. I'm going to keep my promise and have you sent into captivity." There's a law where God said, if you do not obey me, I'm going to have your enemies come in and they're going to rip you up out of the land and take you and scatter you around the world. And that actually happened. I mean, God's very patient. It took Him 750 years to do it, if I remember correctly. 750 years, maybe it was longer, of continual calling to His people, and finally He's like, okay, well, time's up, and off they went into captivity. Well, in that place of captivity, God-honoring, God-fearing people like Daniel and here Nehemiah, they were blessed by God. And he advanced in the very highest levels of the Persian government. And when the captivity time was over, a small handful, compared to all the Jews, it was a small handful that went back to the land to start over. And Nehemiah came to this situation of visiting the city of Jerusalem and saw that the wall around the city was broken down. It broke his heart because he knew that Israel could never advance and achieve greatness again if their capital city was not protected. And so he turns to the Persian king and says, "My heart is broken. I want to go back and build the wall around my city." So he goes back to build the wall around the city of Jerusalem. Now, in the meantime, and all the time where Israel's been in captivity, other people have come into the land. They've been put into the land by their captors, and they've kind of established their own way, their own place. And there's certain groups of people that had risen to power there, and that's where our story begins. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the men of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They didn't want the Jews to be able to come back to their land and advance again. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir up trouble against it. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. From that day on, half my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. Now, here are the things that I think are important to pull out of this passage. The first is that this is not a time of war. Like, oh, okay, we get it. There were battle lines drawn. It was one nation against another. No, that isn't the case. Instead, this was a situation of potential attack and murder by local racists. It's very much the same as a century ago, the Ku Klux Klan in our very nation. Terrorizing, lynching. That's what is going on. Now, there are those who would say soldiers and law enforcement are the only ones who could legitimately use violent force. They're the only ones that know how to do it. They're the only ones that are qualified. These people were simple citizens just like you and me. It's important to see their arsenal. Swords, spears, bows. That's close range, mid-range, and long range, just like our weapons of today. A handgun, a shotgun, and a rifle. They were defending their life, their family, and their property against these murderous raids of men who wanted to take out the fledgling nation of Israel. This is self-defense. This is legitimate self-defense. Right in the Bible, God's people. All violence is caused by sin, but not all violence is sinful. Final thing is that they kept their weapons with them. You know, one of the weirdest things, to me it's weird. People find out that I'm a pastor, and then they find out that I carry a gun. And then they say things like, well, you don't carry that when you preach, do you? As a matter of fact, I do. Why would I not? You know, there are people who've got this idea that, well, in church it's like, it's set apart from all other parts of life. There's something different. It's a weird kind of sacredness that, well, you just shouldn't carry a gun. You know, somehow you end up under the curse of God if you carried a gun in the church. Well, I just want you to know, if you come to church here, there's a lot of guys carrying a gun. And I'll tell you this, that if the bad guys come in the front door, well, I used to say this. People would say, you don't carry a gun when you preach, do you? Well, if the bad guys get past my wife, they'll find out. Let's move on. I want you to take a look at the book of Esther, where you have the same kind of situation take place. Looking through 3 different chapters. Again, I need to give a little bit of background. Esther, the story of Esther takes place like 50 years before the time of Nehemiah, but it's the same Persian country. And Esther, also rose to very prominent place within Persia. She became queen. And she was a Jewess. And as queen, she kept her Jewishness hidden. But there was a man named Haman who, I'll be on a rabbit trail if I tell you why, but he was an anti-Semite. He was anti-God. He was anti-Jew. He was against God's people, period. And he made a plan and presented it to the king, King Xerxes, that all the Israelites within the Persian Empire ought to be slaughtered. And so we pick up the story in chapter 3. Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of somebody, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Oh, just keep your money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned, and they wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all of Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women, and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. Now you just have to stop and think of what this is like. I mean, it's a Holocaust. You know, it's just like Nazi Germany. Even more brash than Nazi Germany, though. There's nothing secret about it. Now, the truth is within the Persian Empire, the Jews had many enemies, many people who would kill them outright if it was only legal for them to do it. And poof, all of a sudden, it's legal. There will come a day when I can take up my weapons and slaughter my Jewish neighbor and take his stuff. Man, I've been waiting for this. That's what was going on in Persia.